The Missouri River is a heritage in our country. We're here in Omaha, Nebraska, where the Missouri goes by slowly these days and is a magnet for folks from all around. The Missouri was a discovery channel for America back in the 1800s and even before. The water resources of the Missouri River go all the way to St. Louis and then New Orleans. Truly one of the most important waterways that we have in this country. The Missouri River that's behind me is not what Lewis and Clark encountered on their discovery journey. At that time, it was much more shallow, perhaps wider, and full of sand and trees and other woody debris. But beginning in the 1930s, the Corps of Engineers embarked on a huge project to make this river navigable and to make it more useful for the citizens of the United States. So the river that we see behind us is running narrower, deeper, swifter, and more consistently than it did before. Part of that was to build dams on the Missouri River, and some of the largest dams in the country can be found there. Those dams hold back water for flood control and release it in a timely manner. But in doing so, the sediment for which the Missouri River is famous drops out in the reservoir and slowly begins to fill the lake that was built to store water, not so much sediment. An issue that we face on the Missouri River is an imbalance, not so much of water, because it all eventually goes downstream, but of sediment, because that does not go downstream. It's trapped, deposited in all of these large reservoirs, the last one being Gavin's Point Dam near Yankton, South Dakota. This sediment that would normally go on its way all the way down past St. Louis and to New Orleans has stayed in place since the dams were constructed. The water behind me, therefore, is clearer than it would be under normal conditions. This is the issue that we're grappling with on the Missouri River.
My name is Tim Kalman, and I work for the State Geological Survey. I have been working with the geology and the geomorphology of the Missouri River for about 20 years. I've done a lot of research in terms of how this river flows, what are the dynamics associated with it, how does it meander, how does it create sandbars, how does it erode. So the Missouri River, being one of the largest rivers in the United States, moves a lot of water. And with that water comes a lot of sediment as well. Prior to the late 1930s and early 1940s, when the dams started to be built, the entire river was essentially a free-flowing river from its headwaters to its mouth near St. Louis. So it was able to move a lot of sediment that it accumulated, especially as it moved through the Dakotas, and moved that sediment really all the way to the Mississippi River, and then the Mississippi River took that sediment and moved it even further down to the Gulf of Mexico, where it helped to build up the Mississippi Delta. Once the dams started being built on the Missouri River, essentially that flow in the upper reaches of the river stopped. So that's been going on really since 1955, and once we got to the late 80s, early 90s, people really started to take notice of it because the delta kept moving further and further into Lewis and Clark Lake, cutting off more of the lake, certainly cutting off the recreational aspects of the lake near Springfield as well. The majority of the sediment does come from the Niobrara River. 55 to 60% of it is coming in through the Niobrara River. The Missouri River upstream of Springfield also is contributing some sediment, mainly through the erosion of its bed. So I think that the other thing that's worth mentioning, though, is that this segment of the river that we're standing on now is a free-flowing, wild and scenic stretch of the Missouri River, designated as the Missouri National Recreational River. But what's nice about what you can see behind me on this river is that it is not only picturesque, but it's a free-flowing segment of the river. The water is certainly moving fast these days because of the high discharge out of Gavin's Point Dam. The thing that might not be quite so apparent, though, is that this segment of the river really has a deficit of sediment because all of that sediment that used to flow down it is now captured behind those 6 main stem dams. The river tries to get back into equilibrium with its sediment load, and what it's doing to do that is mainly it's eroding its riverbed. Also there's some stream bank erosion going on as well, but a large amount of sediment is brought back into suspension in this river by eroding the sands and silts that form its riverbed. When it does that, the riverbed basically drops in elevation, and so the river surface also drops in elevation. Since the dam, Gavins Point Dam, was put in, at Yankton, the elevation of the river and the riverbed has dropped over 11 feet in that time. So that's really a pretty substantial drop. And one of the problems with that is that the river then sort of becomes entrenched in its own channel. It becomes narrower. The cut banks become very high, and so the river really never has a chance to overflow those banks and reconnect with its floodplain, which is really an important thing for a large river like the Missouri River to be able to do in order to sort of recharge the ecosystem. It's good for the floodplain, but it's also good for the river environment as well to reconnect with the nutrients on the floodplain. So that really doesn't happen anymore because the flows never get high enough to top those banks. And the other impact that has when the river erodes its bed like that is it lowers the local water table. So what we see is out here on the floodplain, the water table has dropped since the dam has been put in. And one of the impacts of that we can see is that wetlands and backwaters that used to be prevalent here in the floodplain along the river have all dried up. So that in itself is also an issue that we don't always think about, but there's a sediment accumulation problem going on up in the reservoirs above the dams, but there's also a sediment deficit problem going on below the dams. The sediment accumulation problem that's happening up at the headwaters of Lewis and Clark Lake near Springfield has the feeling of a problem happening in slow motion. That's not going to stop. It's going to continue to get worse year by year by year. So 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the problem will be a lot worse than it is today. It'll be impacting a lot more people. It's going to cause us to have to raise road beds, maybe reroute highways. It's going to be expensive. And the solution isn't going to happen overnight. Solutions to these problems always impact a lot of people. They impact a lot of resources. So it takes a while to come up with a solution that the majority of the people are comfortable with.
The era of large dam building in the United States has passed. In its heyday, many, many dams, dozens of dams were built each year. For each project, they looked at several alternatives before settling on the dam that was actually built. They needed some way to compare alternatives in an objective way. So beginning in the 1930s, a method was established where you try to determine the benefits that might accrue from building a dam. Irrigation water, drinking water, flood control, navigation, and those were estimated for every year out into the future. As well, costs were estimated. The capital cost of construction, maintenance, routine maintenance as you go in the future. Then using some equations, all of those expenses and costs are brought back to what's called a present value. That way you can easily compare alternative A, B, and C. And what you'd like, of course, is that the benefits exceed the costs. There's a shortcoming to this procedure, though. They had to think of a time period for this analysis. They chose 50 or 100 years. The trouble with that is that additional expense when dams were built, such as large, low-level outlets that could pass sediment downstream, cost so much money in real dollars today that it didn't pencil out in the economic analysis. So all these dams were built to trap sediment. And that works okay for perhaps the first 30 years or so. But after that, the accumulation begins to cause problems in many ways. The economic analysis did not account for that. For example, at Gavins Point Dam, built in the 1950s, a graduate student and I estimated the damages that have occurred due to sedimentation in the upper reaches of the reservoir. We estimated the damage costs from information provided by the Corps of Engineers, and we found that the damages caused by not passing sediment downstream so far account for more than 60% of the cost of construction originally. So it may have looked good at the moment, but as we move forward now into this and upcoming generations, there's a bill to be paid, and that is the cost of not moving sediment downstream. A very beautiful river in Nebraska is a major contributor of sediment to the Missouri River, called the Niobrara River. It's the climax of drainage from thousands of square miles of the sandhills, a unique ecosystem on the planet. This drainage collects and flows relatively evenly into the reservoir upstream from Gavins Point. But the Sandhills is named that for an obvious reason. And the Niobrara River carries sand. Thousands of tons of sand every day, 24/7, go into the reservoir where the water is moving so slowly that the sand drops out. This has created a vast delta system at the upper end of Lewis and Clark Lake that has extended up the Niobrara River several miles. This seems to be the major contributor of sediment to the reservoir at Gavins Point Dam, and it's the big challenge to deal with.
Well, my name is Rick Spellman. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I'm an attorney and was involved some time ago in the mid-70s with some early complaints by farmers in this area that the sedimentation that was building up in the Missouri River was interfering with their farming operations. And was there anything we could do about that? And at the same time, we learned that the village, or the town of Niobrara, was also experiencing groundwater problems in the basements of their businesses and in their homes. And so we committed ourselves to try to help this area and the people deal with this sediment that was continuing to build up and constrict the Missouri River channel and cause the farmers to lose their crops and the town to suffer from water in their basements. And so that led to some litigation, which was successful, and we recovered millions of dollars to compensate the farmers. But we also got involved with our congressional representatives to appropriate funds to eventually relocate the town to higher ground so that it could avoid the rising groundwater tables.
We went through, we had to figure out roads, we had to figure out water, sewer, and then as besides that, we had to figure out how to take care of our own personal residences and that process. Well, the Corps of Engineers came in and they appraised all of the property. They bought our property for X amount of dollars. The Uniform Relocation Act came into effect, which I think was designed probably more for highway relocations, but it covered our situation too. So those who owned homes would receive a grant to help cover the difference between the rebuilding and what they got for their old homes. The businesses were probably a different story though. They got some relocation benefits, but their main capital for their moving came from SBA loans. They were loans, not grants. When we moved, we had about, the old town had about a little over 600 people, and we ended up with about 400, so we lost about a third of our population. Then the siltation, though, has just kept coming. If it's coming, to the east and west, and it's gradually turned all of the bottom land around here into a swamp.
As you look down, today is basically a bog. It's a water-saturated area. We're looking at what was some of the best agricultural land in Nebraska because it was all sub-irrigated from the Missouri River. Crops were planted, they grew with very high yields and production, and they were harvested for the farmers in this area, thousands of acres, both in Nebraska and on the South Dakota side. But you don't see that today. What you see is this area being completely flooded with water that doesn't flow. It's not a part of a channel. It's just backwater. And it really doesn't seem to be anything to get much better. I don't know. I mean, even before the town moved, it was studied probably for 5 years or more. Just each year the Congress would grant some more money to keep studying, but we never came up with a feasible way to stop the silt. And that's, of course, what we're dealing with now is the silt, and it's getting pretty serious. If nothing happens to the sediment that continues to build up in this area, Lewis and Clark Reservoir will completely fill up with sediment. And it's about 30% now completely filled, with only 70% of the original capacity of the reservoir left. And they're losing that reserve capacity at a fairly rapid rate. We're not going to build in this country any more dams. The challenge is going to be to figure out ways to avoid all of the reservoirs that produce hydropower and flood control from filling up with sediment. They all will eventually fill up with sediment. And so the effort is to use Lewis and Clark as a pilot program to manage the sediment and figure out how it can preserve the reservoir through sediment management. It's a wonderful flood control, hydroelectric, recreational, scenic part of this, the history of the United States, really. This area has been an area that has attracted attention for hundreds of years because it's so naturally beautiful. With the river now, however, filling in with sediment, it's gradually turning into a hydrological mistake that was made by the federal government years ago, justifying jobs, justifying benefits, touting flood control, which is kind of a problem now because things have changed. Climate control efforts have really not found their way into the way they're managing the river today. And so they're struggling to keep the river within its banks.
When all of these dams in the United States were built, there was some understanding of this issue with the sediment concentration in the water. At Gavin's Point, the very excellent engineers for the Corps of Engineers knew what would happen. They knew that the sediment would deposit in the headwaters of Lewis and Clark Lake. They anticipated the formation of a delta that might extend up the Niobrara River. But because the economics did not justify the installation of large low-level outlets at the dam that, if operated properly, could move this sediment downstream, then inevitably the sediment would drop out. So now, what might be done? We have millions and millions of tons of sediment deposited at the upper end of a lake, several miles from the dam. One idea is to take the gates that are at Gavin's Point and occasionally open them, draining the lake and having the water velocity act like a river that would move the sand toward the dam. The trouble is that those large outlets are located some between 30 and 40 feet above the level of the Missouri River at the dam. It's like opening a window that's many feet off the floor when what you really want to do is open a window that's on the floor. So as of right now, the only plan in place is to continue to condemn land upstream and pay damages for those sediment deposits that drop out.
I'm Annette Sedbeck, General Manager of the Lewis and Clark Natural Resources District at Hardington, Nebraska. And we are ran by 11 elected directors who manage the activities of the Lewis and Clark NRD to protect and conserve our natural resources. And we also oversee the Cedar Knox Rural Water Project.
I am Scott Fiddler, Project Manager of the Cedar Knox Rural Water Project. We treat lake water and distribute it among close to 900 rural customers, and we have 4 individual communities, including Crofton, Fordyce, St. Helena, and Obert. We're very close to the end of the channel here. The sediment's moving 400 to 500 feet a year at least. The way our intake is structured, it's just sitting on the floor of the lake channel, so We're guessing in 10 to 15 years that's going to be buried.
So once we realized that the sediment was encroaching on our intake, and it was approximately 20 years that we would be impacted here on Lewis and Clark Lake and our ability to draw water to provide to the plant. So at that time we started to investigate with MSAC what the opportunities were to delay that time frame of sediment reaching our intake.
My name's Cope Clark. I'm the plant operator for Cedar Knox Rural Water District. The purpose of the dam is for flood control, and with the siltation they keep losing more flood control. And as in 2019, we've seen they have to do more releases, higher releases, which affect everyone downhill. And the way that the weather is acting now, farther upstream, up in Montana and that, we will probably have a pretty good chance of seeing this again in 2020.
Yeah, it's awfully difficult to represent the degree of urgency that exists. Anytime you're working with a rural water system like we are here in this instance, it's important to protect our intake. So we know it's about 20 years out, with that advancement being approximately 400 feet per year as estimated. But we also realize that 20 years, 400 feet per year, flood events like we just experienced in 2019 can happen again, and it advances much more rapidly than that. And it takes time. You don't just relocate an intake and develop a new source of water for an entire water system within a year or two. It's going to take 10 to 15 years before we're able to serve someone. And if we wait 10 to 15 years, it may be too late. We may already be under sediment. The urgency is here today to start acting on this sediment entering the lake and to find a solution that at least mitigates and delays the process.
As we think of the Missouri River, the large river, and the reservoir upstream from Gavins Point Dam, we tend to focus right there in the lake on the reservoir. But there are many tributaries that contribute to Lewis and Clark Lake. Also, down here in Omaha, and between Omaha and Gavins Point, there are many tributaries that enter the river. And what we have now is a mirror-like situation. Upstream from Gavins Point Dam and the depositional delta that has formed, this deposition proceeds up the tributaries on either side of the reservoir. That raises the stream bed level in the local streams and rivers. That raised level can increase flood risk, can raise the local groundwater level into the root zone of growing crops, and it can make channels unstable. That's because there's too much sediment in the tributaries. Downstream, though, we have a mirror image. With very little sediment moving past here at Omaha due to Gavins Point, the water has what's called unfulfilled energy. It's called hungry water. And so that water can erode the stream bed and the stream banks of the main stem of the Missouri River, and that has happened. More than 10 feet has been cut away from the bed of the Missouri River downstream from Gavins Point. That, too, has an impact on tributaries. As a tributary comes into a river, if the main riverbed lowers, then the tributary stream bed begins to erode, and it erodes upstream. So in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, many of the tributaries entering the Missouri River are unraveling. That is, there's severe incision and scour that affects bridges, abutments, storm sewers, all sorts of infrastructure, not to mention the ecosystems that accompany them.
My name is Mike Crosley. I'm a landowner here on the Santee Sioux Nation Reservation. My wife and I farm and ranch cattle and row crops, and then I'm also the land manager for the Santee Sioux Nation. Of course, I was born here, very familiar with the Missouri River and the different tributaries that pour into the Missouri River. The background you can see, we're neighboring Brazil Creek. It's one of the creeks that has aggregation to its stream bed, where the stream bed is actually building up. There aren't much for banks anymore on the Brazil Creek, and so the water often overflows out of its banks, and the ground near the creek is becoming more and more saturated. The Brazil Creek has a problem draining into the Missouri River because it's located at the headwaters of the Lewis and Clark Lake. And that's where, as the sediment comes down the Missouri River and all these other tributaries, the river slows down, deposits its siltation here, and you're seeing the deltas that are created out in the Missouri River. This land right behind me in the back, my wife and I bought this in the early 80s. This was all farm ground, row crop ground that we planted our crops and hay in, and never dreamed that we'd have lakefront property as you see today. This is also happening as far as 5 to 6 miles up the Brazil Creek with many of the tribal lands that I manage. The stream bed is aggregating. The waters are spreading out. It's all becoming wetlands, and we're losing less and less production off of these properties. As this wetlands all gets created, it drives the farmers away from here, so there are less and less people in our communities. The river, it used to be good for boating and fishing, and now it's just becoming deltas out there of just narrow streams, hard to navigate, hard to access. All of our boat docks are getting to where you can't get boats in and out. Our local business that rely on the local farmers to be here year-round, and tourism during those seasons, they're all impacted as this siltation problem gets worse and worse in this area.
Here in the United States, we've been blessed not only with plentiful natural resources, but with relatively low erosion rates. As a result, the 90,000 dams that have been built in the United States have not been showing the signs of age due to sedimentation until the last 10 years or so. So what can we do? What is done? Well, in the case of Gavin's Point in Lewis and Clark Lake, as that deposition continues to go upstream, the Corps of Engineers is compelled to take action. And according to the constraints that they have, the action they take is the least cost and environmentally acceptable alternative. That doesn't allow them to address the big issue that we've been talking about here. It does allow them to buy out property owners and to increase the real estate, not like they want to, but because the land is no longer useful for agriculture. That has been how it's been approached for the most part in the United States. There are a few notable exceptions. On the North Platte River, there's a dam called Guernsey Dam, and that began to fill in with silt after construction. Downstream from Guernsey Dam, there are many irrigation canals that deliver water to tens of thousands of acres downstream. Remember that clear water, that hungry water? When it leaves the dam, it was eroding the bed and banks of the irrigation canals, making them very unstable. So an agreement was struck. There were large low-level outlets at Guernsey Dam, and every year around the 4th of July, they drain the reservoir, let the silt-laden water go downstream, and replace any scour that has occurred in the irrigation canals. The farmers are grateful for this, and they are ready to repay lost hydropower revenues if necessary to continue this practice. It turns out, though, that there are many things we could do to manage sedimentation issues at reservoirs. We're just a little bit behind, though, other countries that are decades ahead of us in this practice. Many alternatives, many of them, though, require facilities that we don't have. Large low-level outlets, a canal or tunnel that goes around the reservoir. We're not well equipped at this point to do what we would like to do.
I'm Mary. This is my husband, Rick Hurd. I was a Monfor. My dad was Colonel Bob Monfor, and this is the Monfor place.
Mary's dad was at an age where he wanted to start retiring, and so we moved out here in 1990, and we've been here almost 30 years. So
the farming thing has had its ups and downs. And today is harvest day, so there are wagons going by. And I guess one of the things we need to talk about is that we have 31 acres to harvest this year instead of...
We had 350. In a dry year, the river's your friend. But when everybody else has had too much water, we've really had way too much water. And this is just one of those years where, you can't ever count on things being the same all the time.
After the flood in 2011, I wondered how the yield would be with all that water and trash sitting on it for so long, and it was a nightmare to clean up. But it yielded really well. I mean, it gave back again, so it's like it reels you in. Okay, let's try it again. But yeah, the water this year, I've never seen anything like it. Dad registered that we have a park down there, Monfort Park, and he put a stone up, and it's dedicated to all the members of the family that served in the military, and so their names are carved on the stone. And we have camping hookups and a picnic shelter and a swimming area and a dock. Well, then you can't have the dock when the river wrecks the dock. And just whatever the group is, there've been all kinds of kayak groups and Boy Scouts, and Dad's had Vietnam veterans reunions down there. And I want people to come and see South Dakota and appreciate what we have, but I just don't know from one day to the next what we have when I look out the window.
The sedimentation of the river has created the water table to raise about 8 feet.
To give you a little history, when we moved here in 1990, Dad he'd been fighting with the Corps of Engineers because his land had been flooded, and Rick Spellman was his lawyer. He sued the Corps of Engineers, and Rick got a settlement. So they paid him a lump sum, and he had to sign an easement that would allow them to flood in an emergency. He would have signed that in around 1980 maybe, and we had floods in 95, 96, 97. Then we had a nice gap till 2011, and now 2019. So what does that add up to? 5 emergency floods. We started working with other landowners and people who were concerned about the issue. Well, Dad started it actually, and then when we came here to farm, and he was retiring, I think we kind of picked up the reins with the sedimentation group too. And at that time, when we first formed the group, it was called the Lewis and Clark South Dakota, Nebraska Preservation Association. And eventually people got older and died and moved, and we formed the Missouri Sedimentation Action Coalition, and then our funds from our group just went into that group. And we've had meetings in Pierre, we've had meetings in Springfield, Yankton, all over. Really early on, I think it was 2001, about the time that MSAC started, we had a big forum in Springfield with...
Dasha was a majority leader in the Senate. Janklow was there. We showed pictures from the 70s about, there used to be a lake where you could water ski at Springfield. Well, now it's just a meandering stream, and that's where MSAC comes in and gets everybody around the table that might have an idea about how to handle some sedimentation.
In the early days of the organization, it was especially frustrating because we didn't have the greatest relationship with the Corps of Engineers. Been at this so many years, and finally the Corps says there is a problem. And things have gotten better since then, but it'd be so frustrating that you'd work so hard and there would be a water restoration act, but it wouldn't be funded. Or the Corps would do another study that cost $200,000, but nothing came of it. We just buried Dad up on top of the hill. All the years he struggled and fought on this issue. He fought in 3 wars, and he was an engineer, and he was a problem solver. And I'm looking at this mess of water out here again, and thinking of the grandkids and who will have this land someday, and will it be a farm or will it be a wetlands? What will it be?
Agencies and people that are in agencies come and go, but some people that live here that can tell you what's happened the last 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years since the inception of the dam. So Dams are, there for a reason. They're to prevent flooding, but at certain times they cause flooding too, so.
It's sad that it takes so many years. I mean, this is a whole generation, and Dad's gone now, and the problem's not solved, but what's the Corps of Engineers motto? The difficult we do right away, the impossible takes a little longer.
This is one of those things.
Those that live closest to Lewis and Clark Lake are most dramatically impacted by reservoir sedimentation. But what about those that don't live in the area, maybe far upstream or far downstream? Well, the folks in New Orleans are concerned because the delta of the Mississippi River that receives the Missouri River has been shrinking for years. We lose about the size of a football field every day to the ocean as the delta sinks and there is insufficient sand coming downstream to replace it. Well, where is all that sand? Well, it's upstream from dams, and it's staying on farmers' fields with improved agricultural practices. Millions of people care in the United States what happens at Lewis and Clark Lake. It has dramatic downstream impacts. The upstream users as well, farther and farther upstream, are impacted by the deposition as that delta slowly evolves both upstream and downstream. It is practically a national issue with the loss of sediment downstream to the New Orleans area.
Ron Livingston. I live in Springfield, South Dakota. I'm worked for the county for 25 years, retired, and I've been carving chalk rock for 25 years. It was a source that I could get off the river back then when I started. And I thought, this is great, and this is something nobody does. They said they've looked all over the country, they can't find anybody, because this rock only exists between Yankton and Pickstown. And except for the White Cliffs of Dover in England is the only place this same rock is. It's actually, it's microorganisms and crustaceans is what this is. It's not even really a rock. I just want to do something nobody else done. I thought about wood, and I've never carved wood. I mean, maybe a slingshot when I was a kid, but the more I thought about it, I'm going to do something nobody else has done. And that's definitely what it is. Turned into a nightmare. And like I said, I live on the river, and I'm out there if I ain't carving most of the time. You can't get nothing more scenic than this. I lived in the Black Hills for 10 years before I moved back here. And that was great, and that's a neat scenery and all that, but this is just as good, if not better. There's a lot of chutes I'm not even going to get into that I've been fishing for years out here because it's filled up with silt and all this coming down. And I mean, where I was at 4 foot, some of them are only a foot deep now because it's all filled in with silt. And I'm not going to be able to run it because they drop the water. We're going to have to figure out a different way in there, or some of them we might not get at again, But from Springfield up, there's a lot of good deep holes. I mean, there's a hole out here that was 18, 20 foot. I fished for years. Right now it's 42 foot deep. It's about 200 feet longer than it used to be. And we got a lot of them between here and Running Water. Well, Niobrara anyhow. But but when you get down this way, the lake spreads out to about 3 miles. And what you got is, it's a delta deal. You can't hardly find cattails out there anymore. It's choked just about all the cattails out. And that's too bad. I still think that's why duck ain't like it used to be. They can't get into that stuff. It's thick. You can't hardly see over these guys to shoot at ducks. And if they shot one and landed there, the dog couldn't get through that stuff to go get a duck. Yeah, in the 70s when you was here, you go down the marina and you could look all the way across it with water. And that's how far that silted in that way already, And there's people water skiing and everything. I wouldn't even want to think about that out here now. You're going to hit logs or sandbars, it's not good. I don't want to think about what it's going to be in 20 years. And I shouldn't say that, but I really hope I ain't here to see it, because it's going to be pathetic. The old kicker is they don't take much to figure out. If you keep building it up with silt, and then they have to let water go out like they did the last 2 years, water's going to be that much higher. They're going to start losing campgrounds and boat ramps and roads and everything. Sooner or later, and there ain't no plug to pull, to let that go through. I don't know what they're going to do. It's got everybody around here baffled.
So what's going on in the reservoir? We have this huge depositional delta that spreads from bank to bank in many miles. It's very large. And even when added to at the rate of several thousand tons a day, is moving downstream only very slowly. Will it eventually make it to the dam? Yes, but that's not the big point. The big point is the damage that's done along the way and the loss of sediment downstream. We'd really like to get that sediment moving a little bit faster. We'd like to have a more natural river condition that can move that sediment. That's a challenge with the presence of Gavins Point Dam and all of the benefits that it provides, especially recreation.
The mission of the Missouri River Sedimentation Action Coalition, also known as MSAC, has always been to educate people. So basically we're trying to keep the public educated in hopes of spreading the word about what's happening to the region. Because of the situation at Lewis and Clark Lake, we've become the focal point, even though initially the focal point was Pierre. Sedimentation is a problem up and down the river. Pierre still has sediment problems coming out of the Bad River because it's raising the water table, and you have neighborhoods in Pierre that are being impacted by that. So at this point, our mission is education. People don't know these things, and we're trying to get the word out. As we got organized and over time, Senator Daschle, when he was in Washington, had authorized through Congress the formation of a task force of the Missouri River states to deal with the river problems. That never really took off, and part of the reason was because it wasn't funded. Okay, they can pass laws, but if they don't pass financing to fund it, nothing's going to happen. Well, fast forward 2 years ago, the city and the Chamber of Commerce were in Washington, D.C., and we met with the Corps of Engineers and discovered that the 2016 Water Act that said the Corps needs to develop a sustainability plan for the reservoirs. They pull out the list of reservoirs at risk, and Lewis and Clark Lake was number 3 on the list. And so when we got back to Yankton, we contacted the Corps in Omaha and started the process. And in fact, this area is the first lake, first community, first organization to ask the Corps to do something about it. I would say the 2 poster children for this project are Springfield, South Dakota, where you can see how far the siltation has advanced. And the second place would be up by Niobrara, where you used to have a free-flowing river and now you have little streams through marsh. I think if you look at the growth and track the growth of the islands as they go further and further into the lake, you know, in reality we might have 50 years left of a lake, but it's going to be smaller and smaller every year. And so that's one of the issues. I tell people that think they want to buy a house out at the lake, well, okay, but your kids are going to be looking at marshes instead of a lake. That's just what's going to happen if we do nothing. And so this whole focus of this project is what can we really do that will stop this sediment from entering the lake and plugging the lake up. I mean, we'll always have a river through there, but it'll be duck hunting and fishing instead of boating. The tourist draw, the recreational draw, the camping attraction, you know, if you don't have a lake, that goes away. And you know, the state has invested a lot of money in the development of Lewis and Clark Lake. That's a benefit. Why should my kids be deprived of that experience of Lewis and Clark Lake because we failed to take an action today?
MSAC, the Missouri Sedimentation Action Coalition. That third word, action, what can be done? Well, a sediment management plan is being put together now. MSAC is pretty ambitious. They have chosen the nation's poster child for sedimentation issues. That is Lewis and Clark Lake upstream from Gavins Point Dam. With the cooperation of the Corps, they're now embarking on an attempt to define what they might be able to do about the massive sedimentation in the lake and upstream. I've been working with them after having been contacted and requested to do so because I spent 9 years at the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, and became familiar with the sandbed streams throughout the state, in the Sandhills, the Niobrara River, Spencer Dam, and Gavin's Point. I have a passion for trying to help in this way. There are 2 scales of a sediment action plan that might be appropriate here. One is short-term and local. The other is long-term and more general. The folks that live around the lake and in the vicinity could benefit in the short term by having sediment removed from nuisance areas. Nuisance is a word that means something to us, but for those who have a marina or a dock or a boat ramp, it's a very important word. So on the short term and a local scale, removing that sediment will be of great benefit. Of course, though, that doesn't address the bigger issue of trying to get this sediment moving downstream, ultimately to contribute to the sediment balance in the Missouri and Mississippi River. The Corps of Engineers is constrained at times. Congressional laws, guidelines, policies restrict the kinds of things that they can do. Those working with the Corps right now are very progressive, and they would like to extend actions beyond that which has been done in the past. In particular, they would like to look at the economics of a sediment management plan in a different way, one that would more possibly justify the huge expense associated with moving sediment downstream. Optimism is still there, but it's a tiring process. And the folks around Yankton oftentimes feel like Charlie Brown, and they wonder if the football is going to be jerked away at the last minute once again when they think that progress will be made. Having been involved in this for a few years now, though, I'm optimistic as well. I have some faith and confidence in those from the Corps who are trying to be progressive. It may eventually require congressional changes to the Office of Management and Budget, and changes to how the Corps looks at sediment. There are other activities, though, nationwide that are contributing to this, and I think as slowly as that delta is moving forward towards the dam in Lake Lewis and Clark, slowly too is the attitude about sediment evolving within the Corps and all federal agencies. I hope to see progress, but it's big. It will take time.